What I'm about to tell you is something most people will never understand. Not because it's complicated, but because accepting it would force them to question the entire structure of their lives. You are not bad at fitting in. You are not too different. You are not overthinking. The discomfort you felt growing up was not a flaw. It was a signal, a precise, consistent signal that something around you didn't make sense, even when everyone else seemed to accept it without question. And that's the part that stayed with you. Not the loneliness itself, but the confusion of watching people adapt so easily to things that felt off. You didn't have the language for it back then, but you felt it in classrooms, in social groups, even in your own home. You observed patterns. You noticed contradictions. You saw people say one thing and do another, and instead of ignoring it, you remembered it. Most people learn early how to silence that awareness. You didn't. And because of that, your life followed a different trajectory, one that often felt isolating, but was actually shaping something far more precise. Your ability to see what others are trained to overlook. The system is not one organization, one government, or one visible authority. That would be too simple. The system is a structure, a network of expectations, rewards, punishments, and social conditioning that teaches people how to behave, what to value, and what to ignore. It operates through institutions, yes, but more importantly, it operates through people. It teaches conformity without needing to enforce it directly. It rewards predictability. It discourages deviation. It creates a model of success that keeps people dependent on approval, stability, and external validation. And most people don't question it because they've never stepped far enough outside of it to see it clearly. But you did. Not because you were trying to rebel, but because something in you couldn't fully synchronize with it. You followed the rules when necessary, but internally, there was always a distance. A quiet observation running in the background. You weren't fully in it. And that distance is what made you aware. The resistance you faced growing up wasn't random. It followed a pattern. You were misunderstood in ways that didn't quite add up. You were labeled in ways that didn't fully describe you. Sometimes you were ignored, sometimes criticized, sometimes subtly excluded. And it left you asking a question that most people never have to ask. Why does this keep happening to me? The answer is uncomfortable, but precise. You were difficult to categorize. You didn't fully align with expectations. You asked questions that disrupted the flow. You reacted differently to pressure. And even when you stayed quiet, there was something about your presence that signaled unpredictability. The system doesn't handle unpredictability well. It prefers people who follow patterns, not people who observe them. So instead of trying to understand you, it tried to correct you. Not because you were wrong, but because you were outside the expected range. And that pressure you felt, that was the system attempting to bring you back into alignment. The first thing that makes you difficult for the system to contain is your ability to see patterns instead of isolated events. Most people react to what's directly in front of them. You analyze what connects everything. You notice how behaviors repeat, how outcomes are predictable when certain conditions are met, how people operate in cycles they don't even recognize. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. This creates a problem, because the system relies on people treating each situation as separate. It relies on short-term memory, not long-term observation. So when you start connecting dots between authority and behavior, between messaging and outcome, you begin to step outside the narrative. The system responds by overwhelming you with noise, distractions, conflicting information. The goal is simple: break your focus before your pattern recognition turns into clarity. But if you stayed with it, even in confusion, your awareness sharpened. The second thing is your refusal, often unconscious, to accept invisible limits. You were told what was realistic, what was possible, what was safe, and instead of fully accepting it, you questioned it, not always out loud, sometimes just internally. But that internal resistance matters, because most people adopt limits before they ever test them. You didn't. You felt the restriction and immediately sensed that it wasn't absolute. It was constructed. That's dangerous to the system, because limits only work when people believe in them. When someone starts questioning those limits, it creates instability. Not chaos, but possibility. And possibility is harder to control than certainty. So the system applies pressure. It labels you unrealistic. It frames your thinking as impractical. It subtly encourages you to doubt your own judgment. And if you're not careful, you start negotiating with limits that were never real to begin with. The third thing is your independent thinking, not the loud, rebellious kind, but the quiet, consistent refusal to fully outsource your perspective. You listen, you observe, you process, but you don't automatically agree. Even when you go along with something externally, internally, you're evaluating it, testing it, comparing it against what you've already seen. This creates tension, because the system depends on passive agreement. It doesn't require enthusiasm, just compliance. And independent thinking disrupts that flow. So what happens? You're subtly discouraged from trusting your own conclusions. You're told to rely on authority, on consensus, on how things are done. And over time, that pressure can make you second-guess yourself. But if you look back, you'll notice something consistent. Many of your early instincts were right, not perfect, but directionally accurate. And that's not coincidence. That's awareness that was developing under pressure. The fourth thing is something you probably misunderstood for a long time. Your discomfort wasn't weakness. It was sensitivity to misalignment. You felt things that others ignored, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, persistent way. Environments affected you. Conversations stayed with you. Inconsistencies created tension in your mind that you couldn't easily dismiss. Most people adapt by numbing that sensitivity. You didn't fully succeed at that. And because of it, you carried a level of awareness that made certain environments exhausting. The system interprets this as fragility, but it's not fragility, it's precision. You were detecting things that weren't immediately visible. And instead of shutting it down completely, you learned how to manage it. That management, learning when to engage, when to withdraw, when to observe, is part of what trained your awareness to operate at a higher level. The fifth thing is simple, but impactful. You couldn't fully fake alignment. You tried at times. You adjusted your behavior. You said what needed to be said. You followed the expected script, but it never felt natural. There was always a slight disconnect, like you were playing a role you didn't fully believe in. And people noticed, not consciously, but subtly. It made interactions with you different, less predictable, harder to categorize. The system prefers consistency over authenticity. It rewards people who can fully commit to the role. Your partial alignment created friction, so you were pushed to either fully conform or accept the consequences of standing slightly outside. And even when you leaned toward conformity, something in you held back. That resistance preserved your awareness. The sixth thing is how you responded to pressure. It didn't make your life easier. It often made it harder. But it didn't fully break you either. Instead, it forced you to adapt. to think differently, to find internal stability when external validation wasn't consistent. Most people rely on reinforcement from their environment to define themselves. You didn't always have that, so you had to build a sense of self that wasn't entirely dependent on approval. That process is uncomfortable. It creates isolation, but it also creates resilience. Not the loud kind, but the quiet ability to continue, even when things don't fully make sense yet. And that resilience is not accidental. It's a direct result of the pressure you experienced early on. The system rarely confronts you directly, and that's not an accident. It's efficiency. Direct confrontation creates visibility, and visibility creates questions. Instead, it operates through strategies that are subtle enough to go unnoticed, but consistent enough to shape outcomes over time. You don't feel attacked in a clear, obvious way. You feel redirected, misinterpreted, slowed down, or quietly pushed out of alignment. And because it's not overt, it's harder to identify, unless you've already developed the awareness to see patterns instead of isolated incidents. The first strategy is discrediting, and it's more calculated than it appears. When your perspective becomes too clear, too grounded in observable reality, too consistent to dismiss logically, the system doesn't try to debate you. It shifts attention away from what you're saying and places it onto who you are. Your tone gets questioned. Your intentions get reframed. Your past gets brought into focus in ways that distort the present. You're labeled in simplified terms that strip away complexity, not because those labels are accurate, but because they're convenient. It's easier to dismiss a person than to dismantle a truth. And if people can be convinced to question you, they won't have to question the system that you're exposing. The second strategy is co-opting, and it's quieter, more seductive. If discrediting fails, if your clarity remains intact despite pressure, the system offers you something that looks like progress: recognition, access, opportunity, influence. But it comes with conditions that are rarely stated directly. You're expected to soften your message, to adjust your delivery, to stay within boundaries that feel reasonable on the surface but are designed to limit the impact of what you actually see. You're not told to stop. You're encouraged to continue, just in a way that doesn't disrupt the structure. And this is where many people lose alignment, not because they lack awareness, but because the trade feels acceptable in the moment. Gradual compromise doesn't feel like compromise when it happens in small, controlled increments. The third strategy is exhaustion. Not dramatic, not overwhelming all at once, but persistent. You start noticing that things require more effort than they logically should. Progress becomes inconsistent. Simple tasks stretch into complicated processes. Delays stack on top of delays. Obstacles appear in places where there should be none. And over time, this doesn't just affect your external movement, it affects your internal state. You begin to question whether the effort is worth it, whether the path you're on is sustainable, whether it would be easier to just adjust, to simplify, to reduce the intensity of your awareness. The system doesn't need to stop you completely. It just needs to slow you down enough that you start negotiating with your own clarity. And then there's isolation, the most underestimated strategy of all. Not always physical, but deeply psychological. You find that fewer people can engage with you at the level you operate on. Conversations feel limited. Surface-level interactions increase. Depth becomes rare. And over time, this creates a subtle form of pressure, because when you don't see your perspective reflected around you, it becomes easier to question it, not because it's wrong, but because it's unsupported. And if you're not grounded in what you've observed, that isolation can shift your perception just enough to pull you back into alignment with the system's expectations. The isolation you experienced was never as random as it felt in the moment. It followed a pattern, even if you didn't recognize it at the time. It showed up in specific environments, around certain types of people, in moments where your awareness was beginning to expand beyond what was considered normal or acceptable. And while it may have felt personal, it wasn't about you as an individual. It was about the position you occupied relative to the system. From the system's perspective, isolation is functional. When you're disconnected from reinforcing perspectives, you become easier to influence. Doubt enters more easily. Your internal dialogue becomes louder than external validation. And without consistent feedback, even strong awareness can start to feel unstable. That's the angle the system uses, not to destroy your perception, but to weaken your confidence in it. Because once you start questioning your own clarity, you become more likely to adjust it. But that's only one side of what isolation does. The other side is less obvious, but far more important. Isolation removes interference. It reduces noise. It forces you into direct contact with your own thinking, without constant external input shaping it. And that's uncomfortable at first, because without distraction, everything becomes more visible. Your thoughts, your patterns, your observations, they all become clearer, but also harder to avoid. And if you didn't collapse under that pressure, if you stayed with it, even when it felt uncertain, something started to shift. Your awareness became more refined, not broader, but sharper. You stopped relying on constant agreement to validate what you were seeing. You began to trust your ability to observe, analyze, and conclude without needing immediate confirmation. And that changes everything, because now your awareness is not dependent. It doesn't require reinforcement to remain stable. It operates on what you've consistently observed over time. That's not isolation anymore. That's independence. And independence in awareness is something the system cannot easily influence, because it no longer relies on the system for validation. There comes a point where awareness stops being enough on its own, not because it loses value, but because without application, it starts to turn inward in unproductive ways. Overanalysis replaces action. Observation becomes repetition. And clarity, instead of moving you forward, keeps you in place. So what you do next is not optional. It determines whether your awareness becomes useful or stagnant. The first adjustment is internal, but it has external consequences. You need to stop shrinking yourself to fit environments that were never structured for your level of awareness. Not in a reactive way, not in a confrontational way, but in a controlled, deliberate way. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to announce a shift. You simply stop over-adjusting. You stop translating your perspective into something more acceptable at your own expense. You maintain alignment internally, even when the environment doesn't reflect it externally. The second is your voice. Not constant expression, not emotional reaction, but precision. You don't need to speak on everything, but when you do speak, it needs to be accurate to what you actually see. Not softened to avoid discomfort. Not exaggerated to gain attention. Just clear, because your voice is not valuable due to volume. It's valuable due to alignment. And when you consistently express what you observe without distortion, it stabilizes your awareness further. The third is structure. You need to begin building in ways that reduce your dependence on systems that limit your clarity. This doesn't mean complete separation. It means strategic independence. Creating routines, environments, and sources of stability that are not fully controlled by external expectations. Because the more your life depends on structures that require conformity, the more pressure you'll feel to adjust your awareness to fit them. The fourth is protection of your mental space. Not isolation for the sake of avoidance, but selectivity for the sake of clarity. You cannot engage deeply in every environment without consequence. Some spaces dilute your thinking. Some conversations reduce your precision. And if you're not aware of that, you'll slowly adapt downward without realizing it. So you choose carefully where you focus, where you engage, where you invest your attention. And finally, you stay grounded, not in abstract ideas, not in untested beliefs, but in direct observation, in what you can verify through repeated experience. Because grounding is what prevents awareness from drifting into distortion. It keeps your perception aligned with reality, not just interpretation. This is where everything stabilizes, not when the system changes, but when you no longer require it to validate what you already see. Here's the part most people won't say directly. If the system had no issue with you, you would have blended in completely. You wouldn't have felt that constant sense of distance, that subtle awareness that something wasn't aligning. The resistance you experienced is not proof that something is wrong with you. It's proof that you didn't fully adapt to something that required unconscious compliance. You were not designed to fit in seamlessly, not because you're better, but because you're structured differently. You observe before you accept. You question before you commit. You analyze before you agree. And that creates friction, but it also creates clarity. So the question isn't whether you were out of place. You were. The real question is what you're going to do with the awareness that came from that experience. If this resonates with you, don't just move on. Acknowledge it. Comment what you've noticed in your own life that others seem to ignore. Like the video if you understand this at a deeper level. And subscribe if you're ready to continue seeing what most people are trained not to see.